present and discuss a book that has been recently launched, and that, in my personal opinion, is going to really impact not only the way we think about the policy interventions necessary to tackle the key challenges, but also all the other subsequent policies, including business policy and all the other societal actors. That's why we think this is a really important event. I'd like to welcome and thank you all for being here. Just an introductory word to say, clarify the logic beyond the discussion on this book. Why is it that a policy-centered book is of interest for the Leonardo Center on Business for Society? And the answer is relatively straightforward, although it's quite important, and you will see it emerging as we go on through the conversation. The answer is that Leonardo has been launched for years ago as a center to study and at the same time accelerate the business transition towards the new logics, new models, new roles. But the whole process is connecting and has to connect across a number of levels of analysis. It's an individual mindset that needs to be developed. It's the organizational, obviously, changes that need to be understood and accelerated. More importantly, it's the sectoral and then policy national levels. So all these four levels have been subject to work and the development of laboratories that we are now expanding. That's also why we connected to particularly Sandrine Dixon-Declerc, who will be presenting the key ideas and insights from the book. We're delighted to also have her as a member of our, I do need to? Okay, I will. Thank you. As a member of our advisory board, which we are particularly grateful for, and that is essentially, again, the voice that we have been hearing, particularly over the last few months, in terms of developing the fourth level, the policy implications of business conduct and business transformation. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you now to the master of ceremony, my good colleague, Mary Ryan, who is also the Pro-Rector for Research and Enterprise at Imperial College London, and who is Professor of Material Science, so he's actually an expert in the subject matter as well, also directing perhaps one of the most ambitious cross-college, cross-disciplinary, and cross-sectoral initiative to study how we can create a zero-pollution society. Mary is also going to chair our conversation afterwards. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for that very kind introduction. So yes, I am the MC today, which means I have to start with some housekeeping. First of all, we're not expecting any fire alarms. So if the fire alarm goes off, please follow some of our business school colleagues out of the building, which will be essentially back down the stairs and out through the main entrance. There are not toilets just on this floor, as you may have noticed. So you have to go down to the lower basement to access those. I'm hoping this is an exercise in water conservation, Sandrine, and not in a great place of engineering like this, any actual technical problems. I was really delighted to be able to attend this event today. As Maurizio said, we've been thinking for the last few years here about how the transition to a sustainable future, which we've framed the Imperial Zero Pollution Initiative, can be enabled by thinking differently. When Mary Robinson came almost 3 years ago now to talk to us and to launch our initiative, she framed it as the Great Redesign, which I think has a lot of similarities with the kind of things that we're going to be hearing about today, and how you take that systems level thinking and multiple stakeholders, not just to solve the problems of today, which we know are manifest, and we are in the midst of at least three planetary crises, notwithstanding the challenges of inequity and poverty and lack of agency among different populations, but actually solve those problems and create a future that we want to have. So that's systems level thinking, and I don't want to go too much into the conversation we're going to have later, enabling us to think about alternate scenarios and how we build the right one. So I was supposed to be in Munich today, and I probably shouldn't be on camera saying this, but I was quite happy when that visit got cancelled, so I could join you for this book launch. So the way this event is going to work, Sandrine is going to spend, I think, about 20 minutes or so just talking through some very high-level ideas that have come through this book. And this book was described by Ban Ki-moon as an extraordinary book at an extraordinary time, which I think speaks to the urgency and need that we really have to reconsider how we are organizing ourselves as a civilization, if that's the right word, and how we are going to progress to something more equitable and sustainable. It comes on the back of the Limits of Growth book, which was published by the Club of Rome 50 years ago. And that book is described as seminal. I think that word is used too frequently, but in this case, I think it really was a seminal book, and it's changed the thinking of an awful lot of people and really influenced generations of people who would like to have agency to change things and to create a better world. So it's a book that's not a single author. There's contributions from a range of different experts and different voices with different perspectives, and we're very lucky to have three of those contributors here today who are going to join us in a panel discussion later, along with our own Carol Popper and Maurizio back in the panel. So without further ado, I think, Sandrine, if you would like to give us a great overview, we're delighted to welcome you to Imperial College. Thank you.
So much, and what a pleasure it is to be here. I seem to be running on a very clear book tour. I was in Cambridge yesterday, and now being here is truly an honor. And let me run you through some of the thinking behind Earth for All, the Survival Guide for Humanity, but also clearly indicate to you that as a club, and with all of its members and many partners that contributed to this book, that we're all truly anchored in, one, the complexity of the 21st century. How do we take the history of our knowledge through the Club of Rome and all of the publications and the great work of the individuals that are members of the club, and think through how we shift through, in particular, the polycrisis age that we're in, from growth to well-being, and why we need an Earth for All. And I think what's fundamental also in the way in which we've structured this program of work, because it is this publication, an output. It's a book, but which describes the outputs from system dynamic modeling coupled with a stress testing exercise of some very high-level commissioners from across the globe, is how can we describe what that looks like to get from our addiction to growth, and Bob will very much talk about this as it's the title of his newest book, to a well-being society for all. Let me run you through first a short film that will describe a little bit the thinking and the history, and then we'll go back into the presentation. It is quiet. Get the volume up. This is why technology is not going to get us out of this.
Put your mic near the speaker.
That's a good idea.
That's how we teach.
That's how we do it at UCL.
Yeah. Old school.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
Okay. We don't even need the mic.
That's fine.
So let me apologize for all the technical difficulties, and in particular for those that were online and couldn't hear. I hope that you could either lip read or at least read the subtitles. Very sorry about that. There is a link that we are sharing with all of those that were online. So hopefully you can see what we were focusing on in that film. I think what we tried to do through that film is, through the voices of all the different authors, lead you through the thinking of how we actually created the book. And of course, I want to mention that there were so many other contributors that were part of this process. Because as you move through the thinking of the limits to growth, we felt it was absolutely essential that we address the challenges through system dynamic modeling, but that we also very clearly stress test the results of that system dynamic model. And you'll hear actually from Bob and from Kate in terms of their interactions through that stress testing exercise. Also, as Mary very clearly said, there were a lot of disagreements. We didn't all agree in certain ways forward that were very specific, but we did all agree with the vision. We did all agree that actually it is these 5 key turnarounds that are fundamental. And that if we had known already 50 years ago that we were risking collapse, that we didn't have another 50 years. And I think that is absolutely clear in the results of this piece of work. We also all agreed that we needed to bring in the incredible work of the planetary boundaries that has been undertaken by the Potsdam Institute and Johan Rockström, one of the key authors of this work. But that it was that juxtaposition between the work of the planetary boundaries, the knowledge of the Club of Rome, and all the series of publications and our partners that have worked on systems thinking and an understanding of new economic models, that needed to be brought together to understand that what are not only the key challenges, but the solutions to get us out of this mess. What does an Earth for All look like? And that's what brought us to this systems change agenda. That's what brought us to a greater well-being vision that actually could be turned around through 5 key pathways: poverty, empowerment, equality, with the backbone of access to food and access to clean energy, knowing that we needed to transform our economies and our financial system and address the interrelationships that you can see here in the system dynamic model for an optimal output. That we look at the dynamics also of pricing, of taxation, of governance, that we look at the dynamics of different sectoral impacts and the way in which we need to transform our industries, but also our institutions. And a lot of the work that's now happening in beyond Bretton Woods, for example, or what is the role of the IMF, the World Bank? How do we address trade deficits and debt? All of those different factors, from an international all the way down to a local level, needed to be understood in order to get us to how can we address the key elephant in the room. GDP growth with population growth plus climate equals deeply negative well-being. And we can already see it through our tension index and also through our well-being index that this is the key problem because global well-being is declining. And if you look in some of the wealthiest high-income countries like the United States, you can see that social tensions, and you can even speak about it right now in the streets of London in terms of the major strikes that we're seeing, social tensions are increasing, whereas average well-being is decreasing. That is what the novelty of this discussion and this book is, and is what exactly Johan Rockström was talking about, even though as a scientist, he still very much firmly believes that we've gone beyond our planetary boundaries. As a human being, he's realized that it is the social tensions that are going to be even more extreme than going beyond those planetary boundaries. So we came up with two key scenarios from this system dynamic modeling. And then we stress tested those scenarios with this group of transformational economic commissioners. The too little, too late scenario, which is basically the business as usual scenario, which, as you can see here, the main trends are that you continue to have population growth. You continue to see actually that the average well-being goes down because of the impacts of population growth going beyond the natural boundaries and continuing to be based on an extractive economy. The human footprint is so extreme as we go forward that we will continuously see polycrisis situations and the compound effects of pandemics, of climate effects, biodiversity loss, as well as social tensions. So that means that poverty only reaches zero around 2100, far too late. And that social tensions continues to rise and that global average temperatures also continue to rise. That compound effect means that we will see more conflicts, more pandemics, and more climate effects. The giant leap scenario, on the other hand, which is what the 5 turnarounds are trying to truly bring us to, looks very much at the foundational pieces of how do you reduce that social tension. So ensure that poverty reaches zero around 2050, that we have a minimum salary of $15,000 per annum per citizen, that well-being rises, and that temperatures stabilize at 2 degrees. And there you can see the difference between those two scenarios. The well-being giant leap goes up, whereas well-being goes down in the too little too late. Social tension in the too little too late goes down much too late to actually cruelly be able to influence the well-being index increase that we're trying to see. So this is why this global social tension index is so interesting, taking into consideration what I think is a perfect example here already on the European continent when you look at energy poverty and the inflationary impacts. So what are the key actions to achieve the turnarounds? What do we need to focus on? When we address poverty, inequality, empowerment, food, and energy, we've come up with key recommendations for each. And someone asked me yesterday in Cambridge, does it have to be these? I think these are the steer in terms of the main policy recommendations that we would like to bring forward for each of these turnarounds. But clearly, depending on the country, depending on the region, there will be different emphasis points that will have to be taken into consideration. But most importantly, what we do say in this work, and what I feel is phenomenal when you bring together all of these incredible thought leaders, new economic thinkers, no one said my way or the highway. No one said it's only my model that counts. And I think that's important because we all came to the same conclusion. At the end of the day, transformational economics has to have well-being economics integrated. It has to think about the mission, Mariana Mazzucato's work. It has to think around green growth. It needs to bring in donut economics. It may be that we apply the donut at the local level, but that we address well-being economics and all the different indicators at the national level. It doesn't really matter how we do it specifically, as long as we ensure that we account for social and environmental risks in financial and economic decision-making. There could be pieces of all of it. And I think that is what's so phenomenal in terms of this work. It's the mission and the vision of getting to a well-being economy, expanding our perspective of public goods and socializing the rewards of the environmental and social commons, ensuring that we address inequity, and in particular between high and low income countries, but also within high income countries. And that we address the increased need of agency of women and the empowerment of women, not only in decision-making or on boards, but also that they are a fundamental part of the economy, in particular in low-income economies that don't take into consideration the role of women, or even in high-income countries that still thought that the care economy was a parallel economy and not part of the real economy. So we created a new policy narrative, a narrative which seems to truly resonate. 5 turnarounds with world-class economic and scientific modelers. For the first time, we have evidence to suggest that turning around our economies is achievable. And that framework on those 5 turnarounds is looking both at short-term drivers for long-term systems prosperity. And that's incredibly important. We've brought forward bold economic ideas like the universal basic dividend or creating a citizen fund. We've come out very clearly in Davos, for example, recently, around criticizing our taxation and addressing clearly the need for the rich to be taxed. And what does that look like in terms of progressive taxation or leadership at the state level? And that we've addressed also as a matter of urgency that inequality is the key. If we want stability and security, as Johan said, we need to address inequality because this is a threat to our democracies, it's a threat to our economic and our financial system. So these are the novelties of the Earth for All model: continuing inequality, looking at ecology, addressing the role of the public sector, addressing the role of finance, not just financing change, but also changing the finance system to truly service people, planet, and prosperity, addressing the role of employment and labor and the future of work. What is the relationship with demographics and population? And then also well-being. And for each of these, you can see that we've delved deeply into what are then the possible solutions. What are the short-term drivers for long-term systems change? And quantifying that feedback loop of how we truly get to a well-being index, taking into consideration dignity, nature, connection, fairness, and participation, working with our Wellbeing Economy Alliance friends and others who have been already working with different governments on what this looks like in practice. And that's the critical feedback loop. And I am thoroughly convinced, and I think most of us now, having gone through this process for 2.5 years, that the missing link with all of our obsession with regard to technology and the way in which we're going to solve our problems today is that no one has been addressing inequality or poverty in the way that we should. That is the explosion that we will be seeing and that we already are seeing today. And unless we address this head on, we will not make the progress that we need. So when we start to talk about new business models here at Imperial College, we have to take into consideration the link with inequality. We have to take into consideration that the business model across the board has to be less about power and profit and more about overarching well-being, which is not what's happening right now in the corridors of the energy companies that are making so many windfall profits on the back of energy poverty on this continent and is despicable. So that's where we are. This is a unique moment in time. Not only does Earth for All speak to today's situation, it gives us the way out. It demonstrates the hypocrisy of the current system that we have, and we're living it. It's the moment where we can take the shocks that we've gone through and tap into the subconsciousness of people who've been through COVID and understood that we needed to come back to what was most essential. It means that we take into consideration that urgency, the importance of this decade of action. We don't have another 50 years to lose. It means that we have to understand that the bullshit, that the policymakers are telling us that transformation is not possible and that actually people don't want it is wrong, because 74% of G20 citizens have said that they do want it. This is not just about modeling. This is not just about bright, wonderful economists who understand our needs. It's about growing a movement. It's about bringing together all different actors to ensure that they understand that the only way is to move from today's economy to a well-being economy. As painful as it may be, it will be less painful and costly than not doing anything and continuing on the business as usual or too little too late route. So we have created a series of different tools to ensure that it doesn't just become an academic exercise, that we can then start to reach the hearts and souls of more people through our simulator, through our gaming, through our media outreach, through our citizen assemblies, through the discussions that we have with policymakers, and hopefully through business colleges that are developing the models of today and the future and working with business leaders. This is clearly the decisive decade, and there is no time for complacency nor despair. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Would you like to take a seat? Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to invite our panelists to join us. So we've got Maurizio Zola from the Leonardo Center here at Imperial College, Dame Carol Propper, also from Imperial, Professor of Economics, Kate Pickett from the University of York and Professor of Epidemiology, and Bob Costanza from UCL, Professor of Ecological Economics at the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL, our friends over the road at UCL. So this is a hybrid. You'll notice there are some people online. If you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question, please pop it into the Q&A function, and Matteo here will ask your questions on behalf. I'm going to start with some general questions for the group. And we've happily got some people who have contributed to the book and some people who have read the book and are experts. So yes, it should be critical. I think we want this to be really a frank and challenging conversation. We are in crisis. We have not much time. This is not the time for politeness. So any question is okay here. So I think I just wanted to start maybe with Bob, just for you to just spend a couple of minutes giving your reflections on kind of contributing to this work and the group of people that came together, and what from your perspective are the main takeaways from this.
It's the online people. Thank you. And it's been a huge privilege to take part in this, because although it has at times been challenging, lots of bickering at meetings, it's been such a worthwhile purpose. And I think for most of us who are involved in the commission, we've got our own expertise, we've got our own areas of research. You know, I've been working with Richard Wilkinson on the impact of income inequality, its negative impact on health and on society for a long time, and starting to understand its effect on consumption and consumerism and social relations, and thinking, oh, that's really important, actually, for the environmental crisis we're in. But to be able to bring that into a forum where actually other people's pieces of the puzzle are coming together as well has been really enlightening and gives me hope and heart. I spend quite a lot of my time in rooms with economists, and I'm often the only non-economist in the room. And often what it feels to me is lacking from that discussion is an understanding of people and society. But here, all of those things were coming together. And I think from my point of view, the book is a very hopeful book. You know, it does give us ideas, and the ideas about forming a movement and the turnarounds that we need. But also I'm gratified to see how central inequality is being considered in it, because not only are the problems caused by inequality so central, there is also the promise that if we solve them and if we reduce inequality, then actually we gain in well-being and quality of life in ways that it's quite hard for us to foresee in the structures that we're in. But it gives us the possibility of a repaired social fabric, a more communitarian life, a quality of life that will recompense us for having to make some of the changes we inevitably need to make along the way. So tackling inequality to me feels like a win-win for the environment and for society and for all of us as individuals. So it's been really good to take part in this. And on the train on the way down, I was rereading and I'm feeling really proud of what's been achieved here. But this is the beginning, so this is the start of something. And I really look forward to contributing to us all taking it forward.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, we work together quite well. My background is in systems ecology, so I was really pleased to see this emphasis in the original work in Limits to Growth, which I read as a PhD student, and the follow-up here, and the recognition that we can't solve any of these problems without looking at the whole system. We have to look at the economy embedded in society, embedded in the rest of nature. And we haven't been doing that. We've been splitting it up into pieces and not really looking at the interconnections. We're in the Anthropocene now, and so we can't afford to do that any longer. Those interdependencies and interconnections are far too strong, and if we fail to take them into account, we're headed for disaster, as some of the modeling has shown. And so, yeah, this whole idea of a systems approach in ecological economics, how do we bring that all together, I think is what this book has really implemented. And I think that approach to solving our global problems is the one that has a chance, that is hopeful. And I think part of that is, how do we change the fundamental goals that we're pursuing? Most of our policies in most countries these days are still pursuing, growth of GDP assuming that will solve or can solve all other problems. We just make the pie bigger, and how it gets distributed is another question. A rising tide lifts all boats, when in fact we know that rising tide is only lifting the yachts, and just the bigger yachts these days as well. So we have to deal with inequality, we have to deal with climate, we have to deal with energy, we have to deal with all of those things in an integrated way. And I think the focus needs to be on what are we trying to achieve? If all we're trying to achieve is more growth, then okay, we're doing the right thing. Don't worry about inequality, don't worry about the climate. Those things all get in the way. But that's the fundamental change I think that has to happen. We need to shift from, and our addiction to growth. I happen to have a book that just came out. I think we are quite addicted to the current system. We're locked in, there's all these positive feedbacks that are going to be difficult to overcome. So what we need to do is figure out the appropriate therapy for this addiction. And I think from some work we've done looking at what works at the individual scale, the first thing you want to do is establish clearly what your goals are, both at the individual scale for an addict and at the societal scale. What are we trying to achieve? And I think that's where the whole well-being issue comes in. We are trying to achieve global, sustainable well-being for humans and for the rest of nature, because we are all interconnected in this complex system. GDP has a hold on most governments, probably on many business schools. The whole idea of maximizing production and profit, and part of the reason for that is that there's a whole model of the economy behind it. The system of national accounts and all of the statisticians that are working on that, and changing any of that is difficult. But in order to change it, I think we need to have a different model, a new model, a model that is not static and linear, but is dynamic and looks at stocks and flows over time, a systems dynamics kind of model. And that's exactly what the Earth for All model is. And finally, I think we need to really work on the governance side of things. And we talked about the Citizens Fund. But I think we can implement some of the ideas of Elinor Ostrom, who did win the Nobel Prize in economics, although she was a political scientist, for her work on governing the commons. And so this idea of common asset trust, which we could apply at multiple scales, all the way from the atmosphere to the oceans to all of the other commons that really need to be governed in a very different way. markets don't really work for those sort of public goods that we're talking about. So I think there is a lot of work still to do in designing institutions, and I think the exact path, I think, will reveal itself. But once we've established more clearly what our goals are and what a well-being economy actually looks like. And Sandrine mentioned some of the other ways that we need to reach out to a much broader public, because I don't think that's ever going to happen until we have built the movement among civil society, among all of the various stakeholders in society, to recognize that we do have shared goals. They are really shared. We just haven't been recognized by the broader community to the extent that they need to be. And so hopefully we're approaching a tipping point in that regard, though.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's the perfect. I do want to come back to your. I want to come back to your addiction analogy soon, but I think that was a perfect segue to Carol.
Thank you. So I read this in one sitting and thought it was fantastic and really enjoyed reading it. I also read the original 1972 book when I was a teenager and thought about those things. I think for me, clearly these are huge issues, and clearly dealing with poverty and inequality is something that we need to address because we know that they have negative consequences. But I guess I have a kind of challenge for the book as a whole, which is, I think we know many of the kind of micro solutions to all of this. I don't think the technical, as an economist, we've been analyzing the tragedy of the commons forever. Obviously, Eleanor Holmstrom took it to a new level, always in some ways took it into different cases, but we understand that problem. And the other thing I think I should say as a backdrop is, growth in China has fished a hell of a lot of people out of poverty. And we need to acknowledge that growth per se isn't bad. What you're talking about is what comes with growth, the kind of externalities, and indeed the distribution of that growth. And then that leads me to, an issue that I think is a very difficult issue to tackle. And I think I would have liked to have seen more of it, which is the issue of governance. If you are going to take away from somebody and give to somebody else, which is what redistribution is about, particularly if you've not got a very actively growing pie, you've got to make some very tough political decisions. And to do that, you have to have political consensus around that. Now, that can be achieved in New Zealand. In New Zealand, they, for example, don't measure GDP only now. They measure well-being as well. They're proposing doing that in Wales. But both those countries are affluent, one less affluent than the other, but they are affluent and small and pretty homogeneous.
Canada has joined.
And Canada, I also would say, is small-ish and pretty homogeneous population-wise. But in big countries, getting that consensus is really hard. Think about Brazil. I would say that one of the problems of logging in the Amazon is the fact that there's corruption in government all the way through. And you don't really address that at all. And I actually, as an economist, I would say that you really need to be thinking about corruption, because it's corruption that gives land rights to people that are doing things that you might not want them to do, like destroying half the Amazon or taking away other people's lives by illegally fishing. And that's something that I thought was rather kind of more, you say in the book why you don't address governance, but I really think governance and the politics of this really, really matter from the ground up. And we listen to a lot of people talking about the price changes that have come about by the Ukraine war. Those price changes, in a sense, are good because they accelerate us to move away from fossil fuels. But even within Britain, you can listen to people talking on talk radio or GB radio saying, actually, I don't want to move away from, why are we not giving more permits to drill in the North Sea? And if that's happening in Britain, what's happening in other countries? Okay.
Okay, so obviously I'm coming to the experience of not only reading this, but also related work from a business perspective. And there are a couple of things that I really enjoyed in this book, over and above the set of policy implications. There's one effort that I really appreciated, which was the effort to actually compile and add up all the financial costs, which are not costs, are investments, that are required in order to accomplish all these, turnarounds. And showing very clearly that, yes, they are high, you're talking about 8% of GDP. And, depending on how you count, this is adding up all of the five, right? It's not just energy or food. That I think actually is a very important point. That, by the way, when I think it does do a lot to convince the skeptics, of course. The other point is that it can be the object of conversations, because that's where really the heart of the governance problems that Carol was talking about really comes to. Right? How much of that is feasible, and maybe the growth, even though we don't have a lot of time, to get to that level of wealth repositioning, right, and investment. On the other hand, I also have my own observations about, let's say, how to build on this work and really address the missing elements of any plan to make radical systemic change. Yeah. So essentially, the book is geared towards, the government, the public actor, which is clearly fundamental for any systemic change, but it's not the only one. Right? And especially when we're talking about creating a regenerative economy, the other actors, and particularly, by the way, not just the production actors, but also the consumption actors, are fundamental. And there are actually a number of points in the book where there is direct reference to them. But I haven't seen, I think, the explicit attempt, even from a policy perspective, right? Industrial policy is critical to make these macro interventions work. They need to be detailed at the sectoral level, right? Because making this change happen within mobility sector is very different from, textile or food and so on, right? So getting to that level of detail is clearly the next challenge. And it is also critical in order to convince any government, quite frankly, beyond obviously the already converted ones. But unless and until that element of industrial policy comes into focus, it's going to be different. The other point that I would say is there are the other actors, and yes, the business organization is clearly fundamental. There are so many, well, frankly, unless and until we actually understand what it means to run a business in these type of context, in a well-being economy, and then again is the governance, but this time is the corporate governance. What does it mean to actually have customers, suppliers, employees, and local community to be part not only of the conversation in general, but actually of the decision making, to give voice to the key actors that are creating value. They are instrumental actually to the success of any company in any sector. But they're not recognized as of today as being instrumental. What does it mean to align incentives to the purpose that is articulated nowadays. Every company, any CEO will give you the nice narrative on stakeholder value creation without really realizing what that means in terms of aligning everything else, right? Strategy, governance, value chain management, incentives, culture, leadership mindset, and so on. So what we really need is actually putting together the various actors. By the way, I would add clearly the financial sector, the big investors, customers, and academia. Right?
Indeed.
Because
we do need to also put ourselves as a part of the solution, since we are, and not just in the business school, but certainly we are part of the problem, have been part of the problem for a long time. So all those actors need to come together in order to identify not just the interventions that from a simulation standpoint actually seem to be coherent and work as well as possible, but actually to identify in a way, the experimental evidence, the real evidence that by making these type of collective action interventions, we're actually going to get the type of outcomes that we want. I'm going to end up by citing another Nobel Prize winner, right? Duflo won the 2019 Nobel Prize on clearly experimental designs applied to only a specific set of policy interventions. I think extending it to that logic of experimentation and then scaling, right? Collective ideation, experimentation, and scaling is actually essential in order to actually make the next step on this shoulders of giants that have written this book.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you now, Sandrine, I'm afraid, with some of these points that came through. I think there's from what I'm hearing, thinking about, there's a coupling here of the critical time frame that we need to start to make changes by, and the agency of the different demographics that they have, and the need to kind of, you talk about empowerment. Of course, there's a time frame to get to empowerment, right, of communities and populations and education. That needs to be mobilized now if we're to reach this in time. So how do you see, I think that, and then of course there's the time frame of the political cycle in all democracies, which we have, I think, the best chance of changing first, the short-termism of politicians, and the willingness to tackle the corruption. How do you envisage the kind of sequencing of this at pace? I mean, I think you're rightly presenting kind of a utopian giant leap, because I think that is the only narrative that can count. But then when you start to unpick it and think who has to move when, how do you make all that work? And specifically around the vested interests that need to be moved out of the way, right, by this empowered populace.
If only one of us had the answer to that, including myself. And I will ask Kate and Bob to come in. I'm really pleased that this is the type of conversation that we get from this book. Every single time I go out and present, or anyone else presents, this is what opens up all the questions, and necessary questions. Because although it's presented as a utopia, I think we need to take a step back and question, what are we living right now? It's so easy to say it's too difficult, the economy works. Yes, we've pulled in China, for example, so many people out of poverty because of actually growing wealth in the economy. Yes, we've seen that there has been greater equality in certain areas, but we've also seen the perversities in the market in a variety of different ways. And that today, actually, we're faced with, in particular in those countries that are supposed to be the wealthiest, because of neoliberal economic thinking, that actually we have the highest amount of mental illness, the highest suicide rate, the highest drug addiction in the United States that we've ever seen. And I grew up in San Francisco. Homelessness problems that are absolutely growing and everywhere. So often we say, oh, well, this is utopia. But I also would like to come back and ask ourselves, are we really in a functioning economy? Point number one. If we want to be truly smart humans, wise humans amongst a greater species, can we please just challenge ourselves rather than be so anesthetized that we dumb ourselves down and live what we are used to and not actually start to take some risks? Because in any case, we haven't built resilience through our systems. And then we get to the resilience. And this comes back to your question. So what we're seeing right now on the European economy, which is the one that I know best, because that's where I interact in terms of the European institutions, highest growth of energy poverty, highest growth of inflation, highest backlash in many countries, potential to go towards populism, potential of our democracies to actually collapse, instability, conflict, because we had an unholy alliance with a neighbor based on an energy need that we already determined 10 years ago we could wean ourselves off through demand side mechanisms, and we did not have the balls to do it. Can we truly say that we are wise? That's my question to policymakers, to people. How dumbed down have we become to just accept the current frameworks that we're in without questioning whether they function for more people? That's the first answer to your question. Let's question ourselves. And then
Just
last-
on that though.
yeah,
I think we as a population we are dumbed down. I think that's deliberate.
yes.
So I ask you. I mean, it's the same question. How do you reach the people that need to listen and think? Because the people that are thinking have been thinking and asking questions.
Well, some of them have not been asking the right questions.
Some of them have been, but a lot of them have been, right? So
yeah.
So what's the? I mean, and is it just that? Is it just the crisis? Is it just the moment of crisis makes an opportune time to reach those people?
Transformation in crisis is definitely more possible than transformation not in crisis, because obviously people feel the pain points. I do think we should use the consciousness around COVID and also value chain disruptions. I think everyone is living that, to understand where we actually have created huge loopholes and blind spots in our existing economic and financial systems. And I think we also should really question the over-financialization of our economy, which is why, again, we have people in the streets, because we haven't placed a value on what matters, whether it be education, whether it be social services or welfare. And those are obviously pain points where we can start to have conversations with people. It's hitting them with what they know and what they feel. But interestingly enough, look at what Biden's doing on taxing the rich now. Look at the millionaires. What are they called again? Remind me what they're called, Till. The patriotic millionaires. The patriotic millionaires that are also asking for taxation. Exactly. Yeah. Warren Buffett, who says it's not fair that actually my cleaning lady is paying more taxes than I am. These kind of discussion points that are coming out, or even the IMF and the World Bank that are starting to talk about debt restructuring and debt elimination. So a lot of what we say in the book builds on existing conversations, and it brings it to another level. And I think joining those dots is really important in the consciousness of more people.
Yeah, let me bring up the addiction metaphor again, because I think that does describe where we are and the situation that we've been describing. I mean, we've known the answer to many of these problems for a long time. Why haven't we moved further? And like in addiction, like dealing with an addict, just pointing out the problem can often be almost counterproductive, because that gets a denial kind of reaction. So I think it's just going to take a different kind of framing. And I think that's partly what this book is trying to do. And it turns out there's a therapy called motivational interviewing that starts by engaging the addict in discussing their life goals. And once you've established that, then you can motivate the difficult changes that are going to be required to start reaching those goals. So getting our societal goals, I think, much more clear and much more aligned with sustainable well-being, I think is a first step to help build the movement really that it's going to take. I think we're at the stage now in the process where I think we're beginning to recognize the addiction. I mean, we know we're in trouble from many different perspectives in our polycrisis, as we're talking about. But the therapy is got to be more than simply saying, here's what we have to do to solve the problem. I think it's going to be, and it has to do with building this movement and the governance issue. And I think, democracy is a great idea and we ought to try it.
Thanks. I really welcome your questions and challenges, Carol, because I think that they're helpful for us to think about where do we take the book, sort of what's next. And part of the answer is, the degree to which we need in our public discourse more nuanced discussions. Instead of that growth is bad, growth is good. Growth of some things in some places for some people is really necessary, and growth of other things is really harmful. So there does need to be nuanced discussion. And I think against the idea that this is utopian, Bob and I and others have worked on various papers where we actually describe, this wonderful place where you might want to come and live because everything is fantastic there. And the point is that all of those things are actually happening somewhere. So it's not utopian. Somewhere the governance issues for that particular policy have been overcome. So we can look and say, well, how did that happen? And I think we must not underestimate the power and the speed of social movements and social change. Sometimes we get a lot quite quickly. Now, are we able to sort of bottle that and make it happen in other ways? I mean, the idea that a Swedish schoolgirl could create a sort of worldwide consciousness-raising movement. I mean, if somebody had suggested that to us a few years ago as a policy, we would have thought, no, that's unlikely to happen. But I'm also thinking of the civil rights movement, and sometimes change happens quickly, and that gives me optimism. But you're right, Sandrine, these are exactly the kinds of discussions that we need to be having. How do we empower people quickly? And I do think knowledge is key. I was struck by the other day in some of my own work, which is around how children are doing in the north of England, that we took some statistics to Parliament that showed that in some areas of the northeast, we have more than half of our children in poverty. And everybody I spoke to around that was surprised and said, were you shocked by these figures? Well, no, I'm not shocked. Well, I am shocked, but I'm not surprised. But every journalist who asked me about that, I thought, oh, come on, these statistics have been around for a long time, but that sort of education, that constant need for us to keep on describing the problem does shift things in the end. But we mustn't sort of think that because we in our commission understand these problems, that we've done that kind of public education that we need to do.
Okay, can I just add on that point really quickly, Mary? Sorry, I wanted to come back to Carol's really good questions as well, and make everyone realize that we had to give birth to something, and it was hard. It was quite a laborious process, continuing with the analogy. It's only the beginning. We have published since then a series of deep dive, including work that Kate does on inequality and others. We will continue to do so, very much needing to understand as well the relationship between North and South, the way in which we unpack trade deficit issues, our dependency on certain resources, et cetera, materials. I mean, we all recognize it's difficult, and the costs of action are not necessarily going to be incredibly low, even though we say 2 to 3% or 2 to 4%, but the costs of inaction are going to be even higher. And so how do you somehow explain that to people? So those deep dives we will continue to do. We are also moving forward and unpacking regional and national data. But what I mostly find phenomenal, and really we were not expecting this book has been out of print now 4 times. We've sold 80,000 copies in 4 months. We've had 50 different countries come forward with, I don't know, thousands of articles, both in right-wing papers, I mean, claim to fame, we were in the Daily Mirror, as well as left-wing. The fact is, it is creating a buzz. And that is what I'm so proud, and I think all of us are proud about. It is opening up the conversation we need to have at this time now. But let's not make it just a conversation. Let's make sure it goes from that.
Brilliant. I think we should have some questions from the room, and I've got a very question here.
Do we pass this, maybe?
Maybe just shout, and if I need to repeat it, I will.
Okay, now I'm just thinking of the online audience. I don't know if it makes a difference. Thank you. Hi, Jojo Mesa from Stop Ecocide International. I wanted to firstly hugely acknowledge the authors of the book and the incredible depth and encouraging range of policy recommendations that are obviously in this. And I wanted to speak to the point about governance and the point about what can we do to accelerate these things, these recommendations, and also what can give longevity. And from our perspective, it would be legislation. And there are sort of two aspects in particular, I think, that could assist on all of these areas that the book addresses. And I don't think we should expect any one book to address everything in the world. And I think Sandrine was very clear about the fact that, a plurality of things are needed for moving forward. So the two legislative things I was thinking of, the first one, obviously, I deal with directly, which is legislating for ecocide. In other words, putting an outer boundary on what is permissible in terms of our corporate practices and what we actually do in the world, and putting a limit on severe and widespread or long-term harm to nature. That is something that well over 25 governments are now talking about. It's a very fast-moving conversation, and prospectively could be a new international crime. Now, what that would do is not prescribe any one specific thing, and it doesn't go into it wouldn't go into anything like the kind of detail that this book does on these different 5 turnarounds. But what it does is create an outer parameter within which safe operation can be can be returned to, can be headed towards. The second element is actually speaks also to, I think you mentioned Wales, where they have legislated for the well-being of future generations, and they've done so on the basis of the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, which is very simply development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that was a legislation very much supported by the public in Wales. And I would add also that public surveys around ecocide have also shown that there's a very strong public support for this. Now, obviously, with parameters like that in place, it's like everything because it affects the whole of what the Welsh government is allowed to do. It actually affects all the policy decisions. So those kinds of simple, and actually looking at, say, the donut, it almost be the inner and outer parameters, could really assist in not in specifics, but in just providing those limits within which all of these programs become more possible, faster, and valid for longer, because legislation, of course, outlives the short-termism of electoral politics. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to try and paraphrase that into a question. I'm actually going to start with Carol, since she opened this whole box. It's tempting to think there's a one-size-fits-all and we come up with a magic policy and it'll just apply everywhere. And yes, we can take good bits, but obviously there's contextual policy is required. And I wonder if you can just think of some examples where you think, maybe not the gory detail, but just what kind of things can we start to think about from a governance and policy perspective that might shift the dial in some critical regions? I said I was going to start with you, Carol, but you look...
No, I am actually going to talk to something which is in the book, which is the empowerment of women. And we know from, you mentioned Esther Duflo. So we know that if you start empowering women in rural and poor communities to be actors, to be disseminators of policy, that this works. It works in certain contexts and not in others. So I think thinking about empowerment of previously very unempowered groups and involving them in dissemination and making of policy helps. You can see the same thing around sanitation and people pooing in their, basically next to their houses. Again, a lot of those experiments have shown that it's the women in the village and empowering them, identify individuals who are leaders, that leads to kind of changes in that kind of behavior, toilet building as well. So that's at the very micro level rather than at the macro level. But I think you're trying to say something about both the micro and the macro. And you are going to have to say something about the micro, because the danger is that in an emphasis on having no growth, you end up hurting the people who have least.
And let me reiterate what Kate was saying, that it's not growth, it's growth of what and for what. And I think the problem is we've been mindlessly growing parts of the economy that have many negative side effects at the moment.
Should we be talking about constraining consumption?
Consumption, resource use, etc. But growth of the physical economy, cannot continue forever. And I think we have enough stuff, if we adequately distributed it. I like the Swedish term lagom, which means everybody has enough. So it's not sacrificing, but it's also not overdoing it to the point where other people are disadvantaged. So I think we need to take a more nuanced approach, but certainly just focusing on GDP growth, which has a lot of problems and was never designed as a measure of well-being in the first place. So that should not be the measure by itself. I mean, it's nice to know what's happening with GDP, but that shouldn't be our goal. And if GDP goes down, who cares? It's not a recession necessarily, unless well-being is also going down. And if we can differentiate between those two, then I think that's what we need to do. And there have been many efforts to do that. We're doing a little study now, and there are literally hundreds of alternative indicators to GDP. And that, I think, is part of the problem, that there's not consensus around what those alternatives are. So I think that's something that we need to do going forward, is how do we build that consensus about what well-being actually means. There's been a lot of research in positive psychology and other areas that we can bring to bear about what really contributes to people's well-being.
Can I add something, which I feel I need to add as an economist, which is a lot of this is to do with missing markets. There are no markets for degradation of the atmosphere. Or there are, but they're not very good. So I think one of the things is that we do know that some of those are technical solutions. They have to be backed by governance to make them work. But essentially, you want to change the prices of things. We already see that changing the price of oil and gas at the moment is focusing people's minds on energy conservation. Shortages of water also focus people's minds on, and so you need to not throw. Prices matter. Prices guide people's actions. And I think you need to not throw that system out, throw out the baby with the bathwater.
I think that's true, but prices and markets have their limits. And I think that's what we really need to understand, is in managing common assets by markets is not necessarily the best approach.
No, I'm not saying.
Like the atmosphere is a common asset. So how do we manage the commons in a more?
Just saying, don't forget it. But I'm not. Yeah. I'm also saying what you do is attach a price and a value to that common asset. That's the point. It's not that they are currently non-priced.
Indeed.
And therefore can be dumped on or exploited.
Exactly.
Or not protected to consume.
Exactly.
You want to try?
Yes, I guess Kate also wants to say something. I think many of us are really
Getting excited.
Really getting excited. And we need to go back out to questions.
Because we have one online, we have a question online.
Well, I was just going to say that, prices focus minds, but frameworks do focus minds too. And I think the example of the Welsh government's, future generations legislation is an example of that. It's a framing that means that then everything you do has to be considered within that framework. So I think if we're thinking of this as offering possibilities of reframing, that can be transformative.
Let's go to the question. Let's go to the.
Okay. I mean, there are many questions actually online, so I
pick your favorites and
maybe
Or try to bring several together.
I try to bundle up like 7 or 8 hopefully.
Okay.
So I guess like many of them start from the same premise, which is like Limits to Grow was a great book 50 years ago, and like how are we today leaders for better equipped to kind of change the world rather than
50 years ago?
Yeah, rather than 50 years ago, and what we tried to do like in the past. And the lenses that people use in this sense are twofold that I see mostly. One of them is this more again about building this grassroots movement that we were talking about, or is it more going to be the highest possible forum to discuss it, maybe the United Nations or whatever big thing that might start a conversation on? And in that sense, many asks, how is this building upon, different from, or cooperative with the United Nations S17 SDGs or other initiatives that are going around these years that have been developed? And the other lens that I see, quite in quite many answers is this really just about this movement is mostly about creating consensus and awareness, or we need to channel specific forces in the society that needs to be together with to achieve the common objective? So
Okay, I think that's enough.
yeah. I think
But
that's
I think, I think there's generally a question of how this is an evolution from limits to growth. I think you kind of touched on that at the beginning, but then it's about who are the stakeholders really, and do all the stakeholders have equal weighting, right? Or who has the most agency, responsibility, accountability, right? And how do you think this movement, this book, this conversation, where if you had to prioritize, I can only speak to 2 groups today that to make a difference. Where do you start, right? I think that's one of the questions I think that comes to this. How do you think about all of the stakeholders in the system, and how do you want them all moving together, but you have to kind of get that momentum?
Yeah, those are pretty intense. Maybe just quickly, and again, I would love my colleagues to step in here. One is, what is the difference between 50 years ago? Well, we are now a full world, and we were an empty world 50 years ago. We had the time, we had the potential foresight to do the right thing. We didn't. We now are actually living the tipping points that the scenarios demonstrated were possible. These were not predictions, but they've come true. We are in the midst of several crisis points, the compound effects of those crises, and we will have to now make decisions in chaos continuously. So, and that is the difficulty. So what is the difference with 50 years ago? 50 years ago, we probably could have made more planning, had a proper cycle of thinking through what can we do to get ourselves to a very different space and shift from the extractive economy. Now we have to make those decisions in the midst of crisis. And that for me is the tricky bit. So we have all decided as members of the club and those that decided to work on this project that we have no choice but to actually deal with the crisis head on and continue to bring forward the pathways that exist. However, we are fully cognizant of the fact that we're going backwards in a lot of ways. I would say the difference was 3 years ago, even though transformation and crisis is an opportunity. The difference is that we've got right now knee-jerk reactions to the energy crisis that we see, the conflict crisis and the food crisis, and that we still, in this very short term, are making the wrong decisions when we could actually use this as a transformational moment and have some bravery and courage from our leadership. So who do we focus on? Our current leadership. Who actually has the agency? Citizens, to either vote in the right leaders or to do what Greta did at a larger scale and clearly hold our leadership accountable. We're the ones, all of us, who are working in this area who have to make sure that the leaders don't get caught with their pants down, who truly have all the ammunition to ensure that we can transform with as few painful points as possible. And I think that is where we are today. So for me, the difference with 50 years ago is, one, we are no longer an empty world. We no longer have 50 years. Time is not on our side. We're in the midst of chaos and crisis. That's why we've also called for a planetary emergency. I mean, I have worked on nuclear facilities. I've worked on chemical sites. Why the hell don't we have a planetary emergency plan? They all have emergency plans. They all do risk management. What are we doing? So this is why I'm a bit fed up. I've worked with industry for 30 years. I was part of the oil and gas sector. It is time for us to wake up and smell the roses and to work together to put in place very logical systems to get us out of this mess. Now, where is the problem? Power. Where is the problem? Profit. In the hands of a few that will make sure that we never get to where we want to be. That is why we have to, within this, create a revolution of people, of leadership who are ready to stand up to the plate and change things because they're looking at their kids in the eyes and they realize that that is the only choice we have.
Would you like to follow that? I think you did. Yeah, go.
It's a great act. Tough hat to follow. I'm going to do this really in a minute, because I think all of this conversation, frankly, from our own perspective at the center, could not be more relevant, right? Because we are working on, if you want, the other theory of change. There is clearly the one that Sandrine has so forcefully described, which is, I would call it, the top down, right? Governance, public governance, and the individual citizens as the agents. No question that is critical. At the same time, there is a bottom up that needs to be also and similarly taken into account, precisely because we have to do this fast, right? And with all the issues and problems and the bottlenecks that we know in terms of resistance to change at the business level, as well as the individual level, right? Consumers, and individual leaders, and so on. The elephant in the room remains that one. And unless and until we bring in the perspective of what are the most effective interventions for transformational change of the business, and we have to identify that in collaboration with the business as well as with the policy, because we have ideas, we have examples and cases, but we don't have evidence, particularly comparative evidence of what works better, right? What are the type of corporate governance mechanisms that work best under what conditions, or incentive systems and so on. So there is essentially, the way that I would summarize this conversation is that we have an amazing, place to start on the top-down theory of change. And that needs to be complemented with the strong base to start the bottom-up component, where the transformation, the agents of transformation are all the actors in the business systems, and the object of transformation are the business organization.
Okay. We are out of time, I'm afraid, and there are three questions in the room at least, so the time has gone very quickly. Maybe you can grab the panel afterwards. I just want each of you to give me one sentence on what gives you hope, right? Because we know we're facing lots of challenges. This is a very hopeful book. It sets out some pathways. What gives you hope, Kate?
Young people.
Different answers.
Their voting patterns and their passion for change. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Dana Meadows, who was the first author of the original Limits to Growth, and her passion and her vision that what we weren't doing enough of was creating a vision of the kind of world that we want. And I think we get too hung up. It was very clear to her that you can't let the pathway get in the way of creating the vision. You can always say, well, this will never happen, or it's unlikely, or we have to work out all the details. That's not gonna work. What we have to do is really articulate the vision clearly and let the pathways and various complex, different pathways work themselves out. But we'll never get there unless we make that vision clear. And like it's been said, I think the majority of the people in the world today probably share the vision that we're talking about, but that hasn't been recognized. And I think that's going to be the tipping point. Once that gets recognized, once we get to that critical mass, then I think the whole system can flip.
So you're hopeful that we're approaching a tipping point where we're going to have this mass consensus and a shared positive vision. Perfect.
Well, how about you, Mary? I want to hear yours.
Come back to me. Well, I would have started with young people because I'm here with the brilliant people. I think the narrative has changed, and it's palpably changed, actually. in every group of stakeholders I talk to, even ones that you know are reticent to move, actually recognize that there is change coming, and some are more willing to get on board than others. But I think there is an absolute palpable potential move that this tipping point is here, and it's not just the young people who are really driving it, but it's every group of stakeholders you talk to recognize there's a moment.
I think I would also add to that inspirational leaders like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who everyone would have liked as their prime minister.
No question. Well, there are inspirational leaders even in the business sectors, the Patagonia and the Pangaea in the fashion industry. And in the same, every industry, there are maybe to look maybe harder in some industries than in others. But there are examples of companies that are really trying to do something fundamentally different, not just new product development or new business models, but a new logic of business where they actually get the various stakeholders into the power room.
And you get the last word, Sandrine.
No, well, I guess, yeah, Mary, you've already given yours then. So maybe just to complete the circle, the deep humanity of people, and that we actually can get back to the core. But I do want to have a historical reference. I'm the very lucky granddaughter of a man that came out of a concentration camp and lived in a concentration camp for 3 years, being from Belgium, a country that was devastated, invaded, and had to build itself back up through the Second World War. And also of a man who was one of the first civil servants in the European Commission and who built up the new vision of Europe. And that gives me hope. We've seen through history, whether it be also what my co-president went through in terms of apartheid, that we can rise from the ashes, that actually we evolve through pain. Pain is good. The fact that we keep on trying to take painkillers is a problem because it makes you real and it makes you feel. Coming back to that deep humanity, stopping the painkillers, realizing that we can build something new out of the ashes gives me hope.
Well, it just leaves me to thank all of you for joining, and I apologize we didn't get to all your questions. We should have booked more time. I'd like to thank my panelists, Kate and Bob and Carol and Maurizio and Sandrine, and join us again soon for an event at the Leonardo Centre. Thank you for organising, and Yvonne and Michael.